Good morning. We are live. Welcome back to Sunday School with Murph, and of course I am Murph. Hope you have had a blessed weekend so far. Able to get some rest, have some good fun and fellowship with people from your church. We went out to little town of Marbury for a band competition yesterday. Our band did really well. So that was a long afternoon, but a good time. Nonetheless, saw some really great bands from around the state. And let's see here. It's October. Be getting ready for your fall festivals or whatever you want to call them, your trunk or treats and that sort of jazz. Let's get the Word of God put out there in the midst of all this weirdo paganism stuff that people are trying to push. And so let's make sure Jesus is in everything. But we're going to continue on with our Salvation Typology Bible study. We're on lesson number 9 here. We're on the part 3 of the life of Moses. Should finish this up today. And that will allow us next week to get into the illegitimate child of King David. That's going to be a good one. So when we left off last week, Exodus chapter 12, the Passover was instituted. And go back and check that video out. It's on YouTube. It's in my playlist for the biblical feasts. You'll have to search for it on Rumble. But the whole entire Passover is representative of Christ. And of course, his timing for everything when he's actually crucified and sacrificed as the Passover lamb fulfills so much prophecy, and there's so much there. So go check that video out. But we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 15. Now, from the Passover, which is the 10th plague, the death of all the firstborn children in the land of Egypt, and they leave Egypt, and after they leave Egypt, Pharaoh gets mad again. He relents and lets them go in his grief for his son dying. Then after a few days, he's like, wait a minute, he gets all mad again, right? So he goes after the Israelites. The Israelites make it to the Red Sea, and of course Moses was given power by God to part the Red Sea by raising his staff up in the air. And, so they get across. Now, one of the reasons that this happened, in Egypt was a place of rest initially, but it became a place, they weren't supposed to stay there. It wasn't the promised land. And as we're going to see, the Israelites were beginning to fall into idolatry worship and worshiping false gods and making images and that kind of stuff. So in order to make sure they didn't go back to Egypt, not only did God have them cross the Red Sea, but he had them chased by the Egyptian army. And so that's what we see in chapter 15 with the Exodus story, 14 and 15. And when it's all said and done, so I mean it's continuing to show the power of God. It's God continuing to redeem his people and bring them salvation, and look out for them, but it's also God defeating their enemies. And what's interesting about this is like it actually says in there that God had to harden the hearts of the army in order for them to actually chase after me. I don't know about you, but if I came up to a big, 2 big giant walls of water and I'm watching people, I'm going to be like, look, I don't even want to mess with those guys. Leave them alone. I'm going to go back and hang out in my pyramid. And so in order to defeat them, God hardens their heart to the point where they don't care that they might be drowned. So they chase after the Israelites. And very miraculous, regardless of where you think it took place. It's not a mistranslation. It says the Red Sea. So whether the Egyptian army drowned in a few inches of water or whether they drowned actually in the Red Sea, which there is archaeological evidence to support the Egyptian army being swallowed up by the Red Sea. Divers have found it years ago. It's still miraculous. I mean, that the whole situation is still just full of God, and there's no way to deny God, no matter how you try to explain it. But Moses writes a song. And apparently he has one psalm attributed to him, but he writes an actual song here back in Exodus. And I'm not going to give you the whole thing. I'm certainly not going to sing it. But this is in Exodus chapter 15, verses 1 through 18. It's called the Song of Moses. And specifically, we're going to look at verse 13 and 17. So verse 13, you have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. So everybody's, the whole point of this is to get God's promised people into God's promised land. And so that's what they're on their way to do. Verse 17, you will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. So God made this promise, and Moses knows about it, and he understands it, and he's like, okay, and this is the process by which we get there. So, this is salvation. It's us being led to the promised land, right? This is typology kind of thing. So Christ is our way through the wilderness to God's holy abode. It's you have to go with God and through God to get to God. Then we see in Exodus chapter 16, manna comes down from heaven. I talked about that the other day. Jesus is the bread of life from heaven. He came down from heaven, and not as cannibals, but if we eat of his flesh, in other words, if we take Jesus fully into ourselves, within our hearts and our minds, then we're going to have life everlasting, right? Exodus 17, I spoke of this the other day as well. Moses was a water bearer, right? Jesus said that, drink of my water, you'll never thirst again, right? So water brings life. Well, Moses has got the Israelites out in the desert, and again, God gives him the ability to strike rocks and water will come forth. So you see that, like when he found his wife, he helped her water her flocks. He was leading the Israelites through the wilderness. He's bringing them water. And that's something you actually see when you get into like Hebrews and other stuff in the New Testament, with Moses being a water bearer, as Christ has living water that comes from God. So God provided this living water back in the desert. Pardon me. Exodus chapter 20, we're given the 10 Commandments. And we always highlight the 10 Commandments, but if you actually read Exodus chapter 20 and the chapters surrounding that, and after that, you find there's actually a lot more law that's given at the same time. The 10 Commandments just happen to be carved in stone as the basis for these other laws. And then, of course, God gives instructions on how to build the tabernacle and other societal rules they're going to need in order to be a full nation and actually succeed in keeping things civil. So we're given the law in Exodus chapter 20. Well, when Moses comes down from getting the law, what does he come down to? In Exodus chapter 32, he walks into them worshiping a golden calf. Of course, he gets mad and breaks the law. But he throws down the stone tablets, they break. He makes the Israelites burn and eat, because they made a big wooden image and they gilded it in gold. And so he makes them grind it all up, burn it up, take the ashes and actually drink it. So kind of a continuation of the plagues on Egypt. Here's your God. And they actually told Aaron that. Aaron, his brother, was the one responsible for that, because they came to him and said, hey, let's do this. He says, okay, well, this is your God, this calf. This is your God that led you out of Egypt. And so, and just as God defeated the gods of Egypt by the plagues, Moses takes their golden calf god and destroys it and makes them eat it. So that makes this kind of insult to injury there. But this brings us to a point where now God's mad. God's upset. He is not a happy camper. Exodus chapter 32, verses 9 and 10. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. So God's mad enough, he's going to scrap it all and start over with Moses. And the point of today's lesson overall in his likeness to Christ, he's obviously not the Christ, he can't be. But Moses is constantly begins to intercede for the Israelites. And the same way Christ intercedes for us, because we have sin, and the curse of sin is death. That's the payment, the answer for it. And as long as we submit ourselves to Christ, he goes before God and says, don't destroy this one. He belongs to me. He's covered by my blood. And so spare this one who accepted me, which obviously if we're accepting Christ, we're accepting God. So, you know, that's how it works. Intercession. We always talk about intercessory prayer, where we actually go to God on others' behalf in hopes that God will touch them or do something with them spiritually and physically, that they may be healed, or maybe they'll be brought under conviction and repent of whatever it is they're doing. We saw that a lot with Job trying to intercede on behalf of his children by constantly giving sacrifices every time they did something stupid. So Moses' reply in chapter 32, they're starting in verse 11, going through 14. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring and the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. So we hear this today, actually. We people who object to God, who want to claim some kind of weird moral superiority or something, will say, well, God just wants to destroy you. Why does he send people to hell? And we hear this kind of rumbling and this argument that really is not logical. It's very emotionally based. But if God had scrapped everybody and started over with Moses, it would have been an actual situation people could really point to and say, see, God's of this mean, nasty, vengeful guy. And it's not so much that God necessarily changed, or that Moses changed God's heart, but he did a very Christ-like thing here in asking God to spare these people. I mean, God's will was going to be done. God was going to still continue on with humanity. It wasn't like he was going to pull a flood again. I mean, he promised not to do that, but it very much would have given ammunition against God for people to deny him or to reject him, as opposed to the way it is now, even back then. But God is real, and people know that, but people reject him. But their reasons for rejecting him are not sound reasons, not good reasons at all. And so, by Moses going before God on behalf of the Israelites, who really deserve to be, you got the pillar of smoke by day and fire by night, and God just did all this stuff defeating all these false gods and these plagues in Egypt. And here's this group of people who witnessed every bit of that, and they're going to make a golden calf and say, this is our God. This is what brought us out of Egypt. How ignorant is that? It makes no sense. Why would they even pick a calf? I don't know of any bull or cow anywhere that has any kind of anything to them that would be able to do what God does. I don't even know of a story of that, mythologically speaking, that would even come close. I have no idea where they came up with the idea for a calf. It doesn't tell us. It's just bizarre. But it's idolatry worship. It's making a false god and giving, God's a jealous God, right? He's not going to have any gods. What we get in the Ten Commandments, have no other gods before me. And so here's God getting mad because, and they didn't have that at the moment, but you think they would have learned. They didn't have the Ten Commandments because Moses was still up on Mount Sinai. And so while he's getting this instruction to have no other gods before me, he hasn't relayed that to the people yet. But again, you would think that they watched all of the Egyptian gods be defeated, even if they were real, which they're not, but even if they were real, God defeated 10 of the biggest gods in Egyptian mythology. And so you would think if you just watched that happen, that you would not have any desire to worship a false god, because there's one more powerful. The whole thing about trying to worship a god is to try and gain favor because you think they can do something for you. And of course, our God, the one true God, Yahweh, and his son Jesus and the Holy Spirit, they're all more powerful and they are real than anything else we could ever make up. And so we know that it was demonstrated to them, even without the law written down on a stone tablet. They should have known this isn't going to work. This thing is fake. This is not real. Excuse me. So, it's just a weird place for these people to be. I don't get it. I really don't get it. But how many things do we turn into some sort of god? Our jobs, our vehicles, our money, our sports teams, our presidents and politicians. If we just get this one guy elected, everything will be fixed and we'll be great, and no more problems, and then we'll all be rich. Okay. That's good for the here and now. Doesn't do anything for the afterlife. So it really makes no sense if we were to actually stop and think about it. The problem is we don't stop and think about it. So we just go through these motions and do these things to make ourselves feel good in the moment without any concern for the afterlife. So we're very short-sighted as far as that goes. But God is playing the long game for us. From heaven, it's just this, momentary thing. But here in our universe, 5,700 plus years later, 6,000 or so years later, here we are. And the long game is to bring us back into fellowship with God. And in order to do that, we have to be cleansed. We have to be saved from our sins, just like Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt to save them from sin. Egypt is metaphorically representative of sin. And so to come out of Egypt is to leave your sin behind and accept the salvation of God so that you're able to enter into the promised land. If you don't enter into the promised land, you're stuck in your sin. You end up like the Israelites wandering around for 40 years in the desert. You know, they get through the Red Sea. They have the golden calf incident. There's more than one situation where Moses has to intercede for them. And, of course, he keeps, hitting the rocks and bringing them water, which Moses didn't do that exactly right either. So that's the thing about typology, especially in the Old Testament. These people are not the Messiah. As we say in the Greek, they're not the Christ. But they are representative of them in some form or fashion. And the contrast is that here's this imperfect guy, Moses, that was used to save a whole nation and defeat God's enemies. And that's how God continues to work today. You and I are imperfect people, but we're here to intercede for others by bringing them the gospel and bringing them the truth of life and bringing them the truth of salvation so that they can enter into the kingdom of heaven with us, which is that's what Jesus said in Matthew 28, go out and make disciples, so that we're all able to enter into heaven. If we don't do that, then we're not obeying God and we're going to have something to answer for. But they get to the land of Canaan and nobody wants to go in. They send the spies in. They send 12 spies in there. They come back. 10 are freaking out and scared. And, this is a beautiful place. And the grapes are huge and the this and that. But there's these big giants in there. And we can't defeat them. And, of course, Joshua and Caleb are the only two guys who are like, well, yeah, we can. We'll trust God. He's gotten us this far. We'll trust him and we can do it. Yeah. And so they're the only two from that generation of spending 40 years wandering around the desert. They're the only two from that generation that were allowed to actually enter into the land of Canaan. And of course, Joshua would go on in Numbers to take over for Moses. Moses had his fit of anger, struck the rock, he sinned, was not allowed to enter the promised land here on earth. So that'd be an interesting guy to meet and have a little conversation with when we move on to the next plane. But it's man's constantly screwing up to where God has to amend or adjust. It's not what he's going to do that he's amending, but how he's doing it. And he made a covenant with Abraham. He renewed that covenant with Isaac and with Israel, or Jacob. And so we find in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. Now this covenant was actually established on the night of the Passover. The blood of the lamb was put on the doorpost so that they would not be killed by the death angel. So you have all these renewings of covenants, again, from Abraham to Isaac to Israel to the Israelites as a whole, and with the Exodus happening, but we get a new covenant with Christ. And the new covenant, let's see. Okay, so the original covenant was written in stone. It was given by word, but then Moses gets it in stone tablet, and it's written down. But what mankind shows is, while the law of God is sufficient, the law of God is perfect, mankind is insufficient, mankind is imperfect. So mankind cannot keep the covenant and cannot keep the law. That's all these people that say we need the law to save us today. There's people telling you that today. We need to go back doing things the way the Jews were doing. We need to go back to do things the way that the Israelites were doing. Well, if you study your Old Testament, they constantly failed and they constantly broke the covenant, and they constantly broke the law, and they were constantly being judged by God, despite the remnants that were being held together and continued on. As a whole society, we can't keep the law. And that's what Jeremiah is saying here. Again, one of the prophets of God in the Old Testament. Let's see here. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. Remember what I said? Christ said to eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. That's to put God and the law and the covenant within you, within each one of us. And again, it's metaphorical, it's spiritual. It's not an actual, it's not the substantiation, I think is what the Roman Catholics call it. That's not it. Anyways, they have a word for it where they claim that it actually, when you do communion, that the whatever little wafer thing you stick in your mouth becomes the actual flesh of Christ. And then when you drink of the wine or grape juice, whatever they give you, that becomes blood in your mouth. And that's, I'm forgetting the word for that. But anyways, that's not real, but it's a metaphor to fully take God within us so that we know him in his word. Let's see here. No longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. That's talking about actually heaven, and there'll be a point in heaven where every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, and there won't be any reason to teach anybody the Bible anymore, because we'll see it firsthand in the flesh. We'll see it as God in heaven with him. And much as I really don't like Facebook, it's probably the most reliable thing that I do this on, because I'm having issues with locals and with my computer and Wi-Fi connections and all that jazz. I don't know. So that's Moses, his whole life, from leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Well, from being a baby, being brought as someone who would bring salvation and is able to help lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into or up to the promised land. He couldn't take them into the promised land because he was a sinner. But, his whole life is representative of Christ. It's, from his exile, his time out in Midian, being the water bearer, just being like this high priest guy to intercede, constantly going to God in prayer to keep the Israelites from being destroyed. His whole life is representative of Christ, and that's why Moses was so well revered, and he brought them the law. But again, we know and understand that the law is not what brings salvation. It's realizing you can't keep the law, so you have to keep going and asking for mercy. That's the whole point. So that wraps up the Moses part of this. Like I said, next week we'll get into King David and his illegitimate child. And I hope you're able to have a blessed Sunday. And don't forget to go out and make disciples. God bless. I'll see you next time.